Hey, hope everyone's doing all right. Today I've got a miracles video for you. So this is Year 2 philosophy. This is kind of a wrap-up video on the miracles topic, because one of the last things that the spec asks you for is to think about the significance of miracles for religion. Now, this could be whichever religion you're studying, but I'm going to present this from the point of view of Christianity. So let's have a little look. What prompted me to do this was thinking about some possible dialogues questions, and this is the sort of thing that might come up for philosophy dialogues. So miracles are of little importance to Christian belief. Now you might look at that and think, well, that's obviously not true. But actually, it depends who you ask. For some Christians, miracles are absolutely central to Christianity. You can't have Christianity without them. For others, like Maurice Wiles, who you'll have studied, they're a little bit problematic. But what they want you to do with this question is to explore the different ways that miracles can be understood, and then link that to how significant they might be for Christians. So that's what I'm going to try and help you do. I'm not going to necessarily plan this question in this video, but we're going to look at some possible ways that this might go. So first of all, and I'm sorry this one's a little bit wordy, I think the biggest thing you've got to get your head around in this topic, the miracles topic, is the differences between a realist and an anti-realist view of miracles, because it isn't as straightforward as realist is true and anti-realist is false. It's not like that. So I want to just start by taking you through this. So a realist view of miracles is the idea that if miracles happen, and that's a big if they happen, then they are real events that take place in the real world that are brought about by God or someone that God is working through. So that's Hume's definition of a miracle. He defines a miracle, let me see if I can get his words right, as a transgression of a law of nature by the volition of the deity or the interposition of some invisible agent, which is slightly fancier words for what I've said there. But the thing is, Hume doesn't believe miracles actually happen. So even though he's defining them in a realist way, he doesn't think they actually happen. He would not ever be convinced by any evidence that a miracle had taken place, because he's an empiricist. He said a wise man proportions his belief to the evidence, and so he thinks that there would never be enough evidence to convince him that a miracle had taken place. But another way to look at a realist view of miracles would be, just keeping it super simple for a second, a Christian who believes that the resurrection of Jesus was a literal historical event. That's a realist view of miracles as well. And in that case, that person really will believe that they happen. It's just that Hume doesn't think they happen. But the point I'm making is that both Hume and that Christian are taking a realist view, just in a different way. Anti-realism, so there's a few ways through this. Anti-realism is all about interpretation. So an anti-realist view of the world, I guess, is that everything that happens is interpreted by our minds. So everything that we experience, it's kind of put through a filter by our minds, by our brains. So it doesn't make sense to talk about miracles as objective real world events, because one person's miracle might not be another person's miracle. So that's a bit daft to try and define it that way. What makes something a miracle for an anti-realist is the effect on the believer. So again, we can go to one of our scholars. We can look at Wiles on this. Wiles is a Christian. He believes in God, but he doesn't think that God would intervene in the world to perform miraculous acts. he kind of says that if we think that that's how God works, then we've misunderstood God, because we've got big implications with the problem of evil there. If God is intervening sometimes to do a miracle, why is he doing it for some people and not others? So Wiles takes more of a view that something doesn't have to break the laws of nature to be a miracle. It's not like that. It's not God picking in the world. It's not God being an interventionist. What makes something a miracle is all about our mind's interpretation. So I'm going to take you through some examples and hopefully that will make more sense. So on the one hand, just going back to our dialogues question for a sec, you could argue that, yeah, miracles are absolutely important to Christian belief. And somebody who thought this was St. Paul. So there's a bit in, I can't remember if it's 1 or 2 Corinthians, but anyway, Paul says, if Christ was not raised, your faith is in vain. Now, what he's basically saying there is that if that didn't happen, if Jesus didn't really come back from the dead, what are we all doing here? Christianity doesn't have a foundation if that didn't really happen. So early on in the history of Christianity, we know that the whole thing kind of hung on that being a literal event. Secondly, given what Christians believe about God, that he's omnipotent and omnibenevolent, it makes sense to believe that miracles happen and that God can do them. Otherwise, we could ask the question, what's the point of God? If God isn't intervening, if God isn't showing these little signs of his power and his love, what is he doing? And what's the point of worshipping him? So those are 2 realist approaches. We can also do an anti-realist approach and say that miracles themselves aren't real events, but when we call something a miracle, it's like a Christian seeing a sign of God's intentions. So they're not necessarily powerful on a real world level, but they're powerful on an individual level, a psychological and personal level. So it speaks to the person, even if it's not really something massively out of the ordinary. Taking the other side, arguing that actually they're not very important in Christian belief. Firstly, you can take Wiles' view and say that it's totally possible to be a Christian and reject the idea that God intervenes randomly. Wiles has got a good point here. You do have big issues with the problem of evil if God is intervening sometimes and not at other times, particularly when you look at all the evil in the world that God doesn't appear to be doing anything about. We can also look at the resurrection and say that, particularly in the 21st century, if we're being scientific about it, it's very far-fetched to say that Jesus came back from the dead. Now, some Christians would say, well, that's the whole point. It's far-fetched. It was a miracle. It was a one-off. But there's another way to look at it as well. Some Christians take it as metaphorical or symbolic. So the story is important. Its impact is important. Its inspiration is important. We don't know whether it actually happened or not, and we can't know that. So it doesn't really make sense to fixate on that. And again, anti-realists might argue that miracles can help us understand God, but they're not the only way we can understand God. Many, many, many people will go through their lives having a faith, but never experiencing a miracle. And all kinds of religious experiences, even the most kind of general feeling of God's love just through your day-to-day life, can bring someone into a relationship with God and help that person understand God. So if that's enough for some people, then you could really argue that actually miracles are not crazy important. They're not super crucial. So just to give you an example, this example's in the textbook. It's also a very famous example because this one's quite cool. And it really did happen. In 1950, a gas explosion destroyed the West Side Baptist Church in Nebraska. All 15 choir members survived because, for unrelated reasons, they were all late for choir practice. So this gets called a miracle. How significant is it? So some Christians would say, yes, it's very significant. It's a clear sign of God's power, God providing, because he intervened to keep his people safe. Others would say, well, hang on, why would God intervene in such a way, particularly when he appears to permit so much other suffering? What about people who go into buildings and do get blown up? What about people who are killed in plane crashes? You know, why would God intervene sometimes and not others? And then a third perspective, and this is the anti-realist one, there's no intervention of God actually happening, but if the event itself transformed the community, lifted people's spirits, increased their faith, if they took it as a sign, that's enough to make it miraculous in an anti-realist sense. That wouldn't satisfy someone like Hume, but for Wiles, he would say it makes sense to take it as a sign or a symbol rather than a literal event. So again, just to finish, first of all, Hume would not have that this was a miracle because it doesn't fit his definition. Part of his definition is that laws of nature have to be violated, and no laws of nature are being violated. Gas explosions happen all the time, people are late for stuff all the time. So remember, Hume would never accept that there was sufficient evidence to prove that a miracle had occurred. So what I mean there is that even if somehow that event did fit his description, did fit his definition, he still wouldn't believe that it had been a miracle. And then Wiles would say, God doesn't work like this. God would not randomly intervene to make everyone late, particularly when on another day there might be another explosion and it would be a tragedy and people would die. But he does accept that to believers who witnessed this, they could take it as miraculous. But it's about them taking it as miraculous. It's about the interpretation rather than the event. Equally, somebody could look at that and say, wow, that's a lucky coincidence. But they're probably not going to be people of faith. A person of faith could take it as a sign, could take it as a miracle, but that says something about them rather than about God. Okay, I hope you found that useful. This is a tricky little bit of the spec. So if you feel like you're having to go over this a few times, don't beat yourself up. I think most people do. Happy to take questions in the comments. Work hard, look after yourselves. See you soon.